Chapter 14. Rader was waiting for Paul, excited to see him. Their meeting was a little strained, but Paul was glad to see Dad doing well. In a day, Paul moved from pauper to prince. Rader enrolled him in school, got him good clean clothes, and introduced him around. Dad was running with some pretty bigwigs in Reno, thought Paul, but he just wasn't sure that they were his kind of crowd. They were nice enough and all, but Paul missed the ranch hands and horses. He missed Little Bow, and he sure as hell missed Toots. He hoped it wouldn't take too long to graduate, find work, and get a place of his own so Dick and Iola could come out. Hughes had already gone to live with Aunt Fran, so at least he was taken care of. Ivy was looking incredibly beautiful, but there was an odd brittleness about her. She almost invited a man to look, to touch, just by the way she carried herself. Older, harder, more seductive and tempting than Paul remembered, he tried to stay out of her way. He did not want to dig up any of those old feelings. Dad had taken to reading all kinds of ancient history and religion books and spent many nights alone studying the stars with his telescope. When he wasn't at his Virginia Street office, he was at the club or away on trips. Rader never said why. When they did go out as a family, they attended the Methodist church where some of the best people in Reno attended. To Ivy, it felt like an accepting place and brought back some of her childhood comforts. It didn't matter what a person's past or even present circumstances were. The church never judged her. Ivy liked the feeling of respectability it gave her, but it didn't bring her the peace she was missing. To Paul, most of Rader and Ivy's friends seemed like some pretty cold characters. Friendly on the surface, but the smile on their faces never quite reached their eyes. The one bright spot was their new dog, Chips, an English spaniel that Rader was training as a hunting dog. Paul did like going out with his dad and Chips hunting and fishing. There wasn't much talking, but there didn't need to be. He studied hard and played hard. A natural athlete, Paul liked to hang around the university after class and pick up a baseball game. He didn't have time to be on a team, but he still liked to play. A group of vets who'd been on the college team before the war were putting a group together just for fun, and Paul joined them. Picking mud out of his nose, one soldier, Joe Brennan, slapped Paul in the back. "Hey, why don't you join us at the Legion tonight? The auxiliary is having a dance for us." He had the slightest Irish accent to match his fair, freckled skin. "There won't be beer, but the ladies do a real good job of making it nice." Many of these young men who had fought for freedom returned to a depression and unemployment. The American Legion was a new outfit stood up to be an extended family to the thousands of returning young men. Paul was glad to go. The war had ended before he had been called up, and Dad hadn't had to go either. But he liked the camaraderie, and it beat being in the house with Dad and Ivy. Paul preferred the friendly, open society of the military men. It was great to dance and visit. The band was playing "How You Gonna Keep 'Em Down on the Farm After They've Seen Gay Paris." A freshly painted sign boasted, "Darrell Dunkel, Post Number 1 for God and Country." No one really noticed the lack of beer because they were serving the special treat of Orange Crush and Oreos. Sugar had been scarce during America's brief involvement in the war, so this was something special. Paul paid 10 cents to join his buddies. It was free to the servicemen, some who were still wearing their uniforms, too broke to have good civilian clothes yet. After the dance, a program was scheduled. It was a special day for the fledgling Legion. It was dedication day. All you boys know in the Army, you don't do what you want to do. You do what the sergeant tells you to do. Lots of head nodding followed. I served in the Spanish-American War, so I know a little bit about what you fellas went through, but no man really knows what another one experiences, especially in war. More solemn head nodding. "I've heard some of your boys' stories. Your beds were mattresses of mud day after day. The eats were bad, and the worst were the cooties." To a man, every guy shuddered at the mention of lice. "I even heard some of y'all's clothing walked off on its own." Laughter. "Each of you has sacrificed, and it is the Legion's honor to honor you, to preserve your memories, and to help you." Applause. "This is the first post in Nevada, and we are privileged to name it after one of our own fallen gold stars, Darrell Dunkel, a young man who gave his all. We are very honored to have Private First Class Darrell's parents, Mr. and Mrs. D.W. Dunkel, with us today." Two parents raised their hand at the front table, obviously trying to hold back tears in public. "Here is a young man who served with Darrell to tell his story." Applause. Joe stood up, telling his story in the natural way of the Irish. "We were both University of Nevada students before we volunteered. Darrell and I split up after basic training, but fate brought us together in France again that day. Jerry had been launching gas attacks that day, and it was like a strange Halloween, with a battlefield full of false faces. It was raining as usual, lots of head nodding. Anyway, once the gas cleared and some of us were catching a little rest in the trench, more mud implied, there was Darrell. Somehow he had picked up a horse's water bucket and got it filled with beer. How he kept it from spilling, I have no idea. Laughter. You know, the funny thing is, it didn't even taste that bad. It was just a little something to bless your throat. Darrell was always sharing whatever he had, so he says to me, I don't think there is one among us who doesn't think we are 50% dead, but as long as we have the other 50% life, we should be satisfied. Joe spoke directly to his parents. You can be proud you raised a man who knew how to be grateful and in good spirits, no matter how bad it was. Mrs. Dunkel wiped a tear, and so did most of the audience. More shells came in. Jerry seemed determined to flatten us. 2 guys got hurt, and without second thought, Darrell ran out to the field to get them in the trench. He was bandaging them up when the shell hit. Again, he turned to Mrs. Dunkel. Ma'am, I want you to know he didn't suffer a lick. She nodded gratefully. We got all 3 back to the trench, but only the lieutenant made it. I think he's still in France in hospital, but I don't know for sure. What I do know is Darrell is a real hero, a credit to Reno, the state of Nevada, the Army, and his family, and I'm glad that he was my friend. Joe sat down, and one by one, everyone in the room stood and applauded. Paul had a definite lump in his throat. Mr. Dunkel stood up. As many of you know, I serve as the Washoe County Treasurer. I want to thank you all for this wonderful honor for my son. He waved at his wife. We both thank you, and we want to announce that we are sponsoring a new initiative to help you boys make a little money for your families. The auxiliary ladies brought out trays of small red paper poppies. We will provide all the materials, and any of you boys who want can make them and sell them for a penny apiece. This is something that will be done all over the nation and even in Europe. For my boy, and thousands like him, I want this day to be a day of remembrance. May we pray to Almighty God it will be the war to end all wars. As everyone was still standing, 2 military buglers at opposite ends of the hall played taps, each echoing off the other. The crowd departed quietly. It was a little chilly, but Paul and Joe went to sit by the truckee. You know the worst part, Paul didn't speak, the dark river flowing by. It was having to bring the boys back for burial. We had to wrap them in burlap if we had any. It was dirty and a dangerous job. Sometimes the Huns would booby-trap a body. You just never knew. Joe smiled. But God was good to me, and I'm really learned to say my prayers, and I am very grateful. Paul did well in his studies, spending time with Joe and the guys, sometimes going to Mass with Joe. He kept his word to Toots, writing every week and telling his stories, but he didn't get one letter back. Paul didn't expect her to trust him right away, but he was getting mighty lonely. Sometimes he would hike up into the Peavine Mountains. Getting alone outdoors helped clear his head. Occasionally, he would find aspens carved by Basque shepherds. Like lonely men everywhere, they left their mark on what there was. Using the hours to remember their families, their girls, their stories, they carved hearts, naked women, words in French and Spanish, religious icons. Paul would sit among the aspens and write. A few months had passed, and it was late winter. The situation at home was getting tense. Ivy had begun spending more time with Paul, taking extended day trips at Rader's direction to do some local prospecting. There was an undeniable attraction growing. It was hard on him to be near her all the time, so he made a point to talk about Chips, about Dad, about school, but he didn't mention Toots. She was his hidden treasure, and he wanted to keep her guarded in his heart from all trespassers. But as a man, working near a beautiful woman was tough, really tough. Dad had vision of wealth and had paid Paul's way, so he felt he owed Dad. This day, Chips came along, and Rader was on one of his private trips for the day. Paul suspected Dad was pretty wrapped up with some weird stuff the Rosicrucians were doing, judging by Dad's book. Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law, supposedly dictated by dead Egyptian, The Key of Solomon by Lydell Mathers, An Adept of the Golden Dawn, and shelves of others. It seemed an obsession with Dad. Some of Dad's friends would come to the house to discuss, study, and practice some of the rites and rituals. Paul recognized several of them from the club, but also from church. Paul was damn glad to keep clear of all of that. It felt pretty creepy. He loved the outdoors, even in the cold. Chips was in a good mood, digging his nose in little piles of snow. They had driven down to the Carson City area, checking out some old abandoned areas dating to the Comstock rush. Ivy and Rader were convinced that there were still some areas of rich ore, even if the big veins had played out. At every opportunity, one by one, they methodically worked through all the old districts: Peavine, Pine Nut, Palmyra. Ivy kept catalog pictures and notes. Paul was a second pair of eyes and used Ivy's mineral guides and historical notes as reference. So far, there hadn't been anything to even take back as testable sample. Ivy and Rader were intrigued by Indian stories of a long underground river that connected Pyramid Lake to Lake Tahoe. It seemed reasonable there might be significant new discoveries where water flowed if they could only find an access. Ivy had focused on caves and earthquakes as exposing possible entry points. After all, it was rising water that had ultimately closed off a lot of the old silver tunnels in the Comstock. It was the end of another cold, frustrating day when Paul heard Chip's yelp. The dog had been happily chasing a ground squirrel who had refused to take his winter nap. Paul paused. He couldn't see Chips. Another yelp, but it sounded like he was in a well. Paul followed the sound and was standing by a big sagebrush when Ivy hurried over. Paul reached down beside the plant, discovering a small cavity that Chips had fallen into. His fur was dirty. Actually, Paul noticed, it was muddy. He fished a stick with a rag tied to the end. It was past where he had pulled Chips out, and he hadn't hit bottom. The rag was damp when he pulled it out. Ivy began excitedly pacing around, talking to herself, occasionally turned to Paul. The Chinese wrote about geobotany 1,000 years ago. A few old-timers swear if you find certain plants, you'll find the ore. An old man in the camps swore big sagebrush was one of those plants. And look, there seems to be water near it. Underground water. Paul, this could be it. We need to get some water samples and maybe file here so we can do some more testing. Ivy didn't even check on Chips, who was snuggled down in Paul's arms. She was making notes, marking the map, taking pictures. Paul jotted down a poem. He loved puzzles and mysteries, and to him words were more of a map than pictures. Wild boar and panther shit, trees all barked and bushes bit. Wildcat yell and beaver sound, earth tore up for miles around. Where hills are shaken, earth a-quakin', rocks all hot and mud a-bakin'. Wild horse hair and panther's toe, where the jackals howl and the buzzards crow. Lion's mouth and sides all bloody, crick tore up and runnin' muddy. Snakes all mad and gophers millin', she-bears hot and piss a-spillin'. In an unspoken agreement, neither said anything to Rader, and both did some thinking. Ivy had largely ignored Paul when he had come to live with them, but after today, Ivy suddenly saw him with new eyes. Here was not an awkward mountain boy, but a virile young man. Rader seemed shriveled in comparison, and Ivy let her thoughts freely roam to erotic contemplations. It didn't really matter anyway. It was only in her imagination, so what was the harm? She was perfectly happy to believe the lie. Rader had not been intimate with her for some time, so a woman was entitled to get a little satisfaction from somewhere after all. Paul and Ivy weren't the only ones doing some thinking. In the peaceful quiet of deep snow in Winnemucca, Toots sat down for the 100th time to write Paul. He had even sent her pre-stamped envelopes, but she had been afraid. Finally, taking pencil in hand, she wrote with determination. Dear Paul, I am so sorry I've been ornery and not written you back. I've kept all your letters and read them over and over. You were honest in what you said to me when you left. So I want to write you now and... What could she say? Did she love him? Was she just lonely? What did she want? Toots laid down her pencil, looking out the window at the sparkling white snow on the ground, clean and fresh. A week passed and Rader was at work. Paul was in the bathtub when Ivy opened the door. She had made up her mind. Paul was the man for her. They had the brains and youth to make claims and hold them. She had been buying stocks in her own name, taking a little cash out of the household budget to build her own bank account. She should have seen it back in West Virginia, but she had grown up now. A grown woman who could run her own life. Some years older than Paul, she had experience of all kinds that she could share with him. And she wanted a man who could be her partner, a man who could please her. Damn, Ivy, what the hell are you doing? Paul grabbed for the towel. Without words, Ivy sensuously disrobed in front of him, almost like a dance, and Paul could not take his eyes off of her. She ran her hands over her body, then guided his hands over all of her. Ivy played every trick she'd ever seen, learned, or imagined to make him take her. Paul closed his eyes and tried to leave it, but it was just too much. The towel and every barrier that he had tried to keep between them came down. A jackrabbit shadow drummed its foot in the corner, playing a flute between bouts of crazy laughter. Toots raised her pencil again. I know that you've been square with me. I want you to know there is no other man in my life. I believe I would like to spend a lot more time with you. Come visit this spring when you can, and I will try to come see you. Yours always, Toots. Feeling particularly bold, she added a tiny bit of apple blossom perfume to the note, in case Paul had missed the point. The next day, Paul felt like total shit. The moment had been glorious pleasure like he had never imagined. How he wished it could have lasted forever. But the dawn did come, gray and filled with bitterness and remorse. He desperately wished he were Catholic so he could go to confession. Maybe the father would see him anyway. He had to talk to Joe. And what about his promise to Toots to be honest? He wasn't off the hook just because she hadn't written him. She hadn't made any promises. Thank God he had time alone. He should write a letter right now to Toots confessing everything. But what if she didn't care? It would be just unnecessary airing of dirty laundry. What if he did take up with Ivy? She made it clear there was money and property to be had, but Paul dismissed that right away. A man had to live with himself. He wasn't going to steal his father's wife and be a kept man. He took Chips for a walk in some fields to talk it over with the dog and with God. He waited a week to write Toots, and then with tears and humility confessed everything. 2 days later, Toots's first letter to him arrived. He felt like ripping his heart out. Now he just had to wait and see if Toots would forgive him. Paul made himself scarce, making up excuses to never be home. Rader didn't seem to care much as long as Paul was making good grades. Paul should have left. He felt like a dirty dog for taking Dad's money, but he needed to finish school and get a good job if there was any hope for him and Toots. A man had to be able to provide for a wife, and Toots had believed in him when he was flat bust. He continued writing, including jokes and Will Rogers quotes in his letters, hoping to lighten the mood. She didn't write back. In the meantime, Ivy wasn't letting any grass grow under her feet. In a stroke of incredible luck, she received a letter from the county notifying her that there were some irregularities with the marriage license paperwork, which inferred that perhaps she and Rader were not married at all. Ivy laughed out loud, dancing with the dog. Everything that had happened, and she and Rader weren't even married. Surely this would convince Paul that it was perfectly fine for them to be together. She knew he still wanted her, and she planned to keep him. For the third time, she found herself pregnant, but she didn't know for certain who the father was. It didn't matter. She wasn't going to let anything stand in her way of a new life, the life she left West Virginia for in the first place. She was referred to a Dr. Aiken, who took care of these things. His nurse Violet showed her into the waiting room. Really, he reassured her, this is no problem at all, Mrs. Thompson. Does your husband know about this? Ivy shook her head. And it will cost you a bit more to keep things quiet, you know. Ivy knew. A whole industry had risen around the Reno jumpy wumps, or headache, that naturally coincided with the divorce industry. She was just glad she lived somewhere that money could buy a little discretion. Money changed hands, arrangements were made, the appointment set. The procedure itself was fairly quick and painless, just a little pressure and a pinch. Dr. Aiken gave her a little gas to ease the anxiety, his breath smelling just slightly of whiskey. Echo drove her home. Ivy excused herself early with a sick headache and fell asleep. And in a dream, she saw Rader smile wanly and tell her the devil told him to kill her as he placed his hands around her throat. Severe cramping woke her up. She was alone again. She locked herself in the bedroom to ride out the misery, and she began to hemorrhage. Bright red blood pooled into liquid red tiles against the black and white floor. Ivy realized she had been torn inside as small chunks of purple meat dropped out. A pale white worm the size of a thumbnail fell on top of the gore. Tiny hands and tiny feet. It was her baby, and Ivy passed out. The night finally passed. The bleeding lessened. Exhausted, she cleaned up the mess, hiding the evidence. She forced the ugliness, the trauma out of her mind. Violent images and disaster frequently crowded her thoughts these days. She thought about Paul. She thought about her investments. And when her mind refused to obey, she thought about the black opal, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She lay in bed for 3 days. Echo, true friend that she was, brought her food and news without recrimination. Rader never checked on her. Did he know, she wondered? Did he care? He never said. He went on a business trip. Sitting up in her pale pink dressing gown, Ivy was sorting the mail. An invitation to a church charity bazaar, the daily paper, and a letter for Paul from Winnemucca. It looked like a woman's writing. Ivy read it, and in a fury, forgetting her weakness, she tore into Paul's room, looking for more letters. She found one he had started to Toots, clearly filled with love and affection. The one in her hand from this woman also seemed filled with forgiveness and affection. What had she given up for Paul? What could she possibly give him? And Paul was faced with all fury of hell when she showed him the letters. How could you betray me like this? She spat. Paul answered in slow, measured tones. You are my father's wife. What we did was wrong. I never should have stayed. But Ivy began to giggle at the ridiculousness of it all. I'm not his wife. What are you talking about? Paul was impatient. There was a mistake on the paperwork. I don't know how, but we're not legally married. And she expected Paul to somehow be glad that this news would change everything. But it didn't. He just looked at her. Does Dad know? He asked, dumbfounded. I haven't told him. I just wanted everything in place before we started our life together. Paul leveled with her. Ivy, I don't want a life with you. That was when we were both back home. She screamed at him. Don't you know what I've done for you? Now Paul was really nervous. What are you talking about? I ended my pregnancy so we could have a clean start. Paul shook her fiercely, almost in blind rage. Whose baby was it? He shouted. She didn't answer. Paul packed his gear and 3 minutes flat and was out the door, walking toward springtime and apple blossoms. She shouted after him in the street, Why does it matter? And slammed the door. He was just being young and foolish, she consoled herself. When she got all the money together and filed on the claims they'd been scouting and photographing, he'd change his mind. Ivy wasn't going to worry about some ignorant, uneducated country girl upstaging her. Everything would be fine. She just had to be patient. She reached down to pet Chips, but he ran and hid under the couch. Ivy took out the photos of the trip to Carson, painstakingly hand-tinting each one, intentionally putting no information on the back. She hid the pictures and the negatives. Paul would change his mind when she was free. She would just write her will as a single woman, leaving it all to him. Rader came home for lunch.